Podcast.
Herald and News, your news now.
The Herald and News.
Empowering the community.
Basin Views.
Herald and News, your news now. Klamath Falls, Oregon.
The Herald and News.
Podcast. Empowering the community and serving the Klamath Basin. This is the Herald and News Basin Views podcast. Greetings and welcome to Basin Views, a Herald and News podcast featuring interviews with local experts discussing issues important to the Klamath Basin. I'm Kurt Lidke with the Herald and News. This week we are joined by Todd Kepple, director of the Klamath County Museum and resident expert on all things historical in the Klamath Basin. Todd, thank you so much for taking some time out of your schedule to join us.
Yeah, you bet, Kurt. Glad to be here. And I'd say maybe a little bit of an expert on some things local. There's a lot of things that we keep learning all the time, things that we just don't know. We can't get all of it down. You can't get everything in one brain. You really can't get everything in one museum. We just do the best we can.
There's certain burden of expectation, I suppose, as being the director of the museum, that people assume that if they have some question historical, I know, I'll call Todd. He'll know.
Well, there's people that do that, and sometimes we can satisfy them and sometimes not. One thing I like to point out is that I'm not a historian and I don't really have credentials as a museum professional. We do have a professional curator who is in charge of protecting our collection. So I'm just the general manager, really, but I've lived in the basin for 28 years, and so people do call me with all sorts of random questions about the history of this or that.
Well, you say you're not an official historian, but you do have a rather fascinating background, and I always like to start these things off with a little bit of background on who our guests are before we delve into the Klamath County Museum and all that it entails. Could you tell us a little bit more about Todd Kepple, please?
Well, sure. I've been in Klamath Falls for closing in on 28 years now. It was actually former managing editor Pat Bushy that recently retired from the Herald and News that hired me to come here in 1990. I worked for 7 years covering natural resources for the Herald and News, including agriculture and the timber industry, as well as water issues and just general environmental issues. And then after 15 years at the newspaper altogether, I applied for the job at the county managing the museum and was lucky enough to get that job. And it's been a great run.
Well, the museum is pretty fascinating for a couple of different reasons, I think. Now, first of all, I'm just a huge fan of history. I'm constantly watching old documentaries and trying to learn more. So it's a great place to absorb some of the local history, having not lived in the basin nearly as long as you have. I've only been here a couple of years. What do you like about the Klamath County Museum?
Well, so we have an interesting building that we're housed in, first of all. In fact, the old armory building that houses the main museum, we consider it to be our largest artifact. And it is an artifact. It requires quite a bit of care. It's an 85-year-old building, and so keeping up with the maintenance issues is a bit of a challenge there. And the museum has been in business since 1954, so there's been quite an accumulation of materials there, archives and records, and of course antiques. Just mementos that families, business people in the basin have contributed over the years. So it's a fascinating place to work and just see all of that material, the photos. I always love digging out old photos. One of the things that is my favorite chores is a photo of the week selection. We spend maybe a few hours researching a particular photo. We submit that photo to the Herald and News, and it runs in the Connections page every Sunday. And then we also post that photo on Facebook, and it gets shared by a number of people, and usually get quite a few interesting comments, and we usually learn something that we didn't know about some of the photos that we post. And so that's just one of the very gratifying parts of the job.
I would imagine being able to operate a museum every day, if not every week, there's something new you learn where you went, I didn't realize that. I can recall maybe a year or so ago, I was digging through the newspaper's archives for a special project, and it seemed every page I was flipping through the decades, I would find some crazy story that had been lost to time that had been preserved in the pages of the old Herald and News, and even before it was the Herald and News. How often do you come across somewhere like, I didn't realize that? That's pretty cool.
Well, sure. And Kurt, one thing I learned when I was still working at the papers, I'd go to the museum and dig through the old bound volumes of the newspapers. And one thing you learn is that there's really nothing new. You read the same stories, for instance, water issues and timber issues. A lot of those concerns that we have now were concerns 50 years ago and more. And so some of these issues just never go away. They just change and morph from one shape to another. But we keep discussing the water issues generation after generation, probably will always will.
The museum itself is kind of an interesting artifact, as you alluded to. The history of the building before it was a museum, it was an armory, and that's actually pretty obvious for people who take a closer look at the main entrance. There's some doughboys out front, and there's also, I don't recall if it's a lamp post or something, but that looks like it's made out of a World War I shell. Is that right?
They're artillery shells, 11-inch artillery shells that harken back to the days when the 249th Coast Artillery unit that was there, Battery D of the 249th Coast Artillery, was based here in Klamath Falls. The armory was built in 1935. It was the first actual dedicated armory that the National Guard had here in Klamath Falls. The fact that it was built during the depths of the Great Depression always impresses me because it is a fairly large structure. But it didn't suit the National Guard all that well. The National Guard was only in there for about 20 years, and then they built another armory on Shasta Way. That's now the city police headquarters. And the National Guard's now out at Kingsley Field. So, there have been a lot of changes, but the museum has been housed inside the old armory building for about 40 years now.
And for a time, if I recall correctly, it was also a concert venue for a bit. Is that true?
Yeah, sure. Like a lot of armories, our armory doubled as a community event center. So a lot of concerts, a lot of sporting events, wrestling matches. We had the professional wrestlers, the women wrestlers, the midget wrestlers, a lot of boxing matches. A lot of people remember Sheriff Red Britton, Murray Britton, went by the nickname of Red, who was a boxer himself and boxed in the armory and then later refereed in the armory for quite a few years. Concerts, a lot of big name acts back in the 40s and 50s especially, basketball tournaments, dances, car shows, circuses. We've had elephants on the wooden floor of the museum at various times over the years. So a lot of history right there inside the building.
There's a lot of history that can be found now inside the building. So tell me about some of the exhibits for people who either haven't been or it's been a long time since they've gone.
Well, one of the things we've enjoyed recently is having enough funding to have a professional curator. Niles Reynolds is our curator, and he's really talented in a number of ways. He's an archaeologist by training, but he also has great experience with developing artifacts and working closely with our maintenance technician, Jim McClure. The two of them have teamed up to do some beautiful exhibits. One that's been open for a couple of years now features fossils that have been found here in the Klamath Basin. That's always popular with the kids, and it's right there near the front entrance of our museum, so it's a place that a lot of people like to hit. And it's just beautifully done, so very happy to have Niles and Jim working with us and doing those kinds of exhibits. So they actually did an exhibit about the history of the armory building itself. This year, the biggest, nicest exhibit that they opened was on the Japanese balloon bomb. And it combines technology with artifacts, video, and it's really a beautifully done exhibit. We also just opened an exhibit fairly recently on Ernie Brace, who I think you're familiar with his story. A lot of people are. A gentleman who was a prisoner of war as a civilian, a prisoner of war in Laos and North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. An amazing story that he lived, and so we are happy to have a little exhibit on his life and the experiences that he went through.
The timing of that one, at least being publicly announced, was fascinating because Ernie did become very good friends with John McCain, and you ended up having a reception on the same day that John McCain's funeral was held. It's almost as if you planned it that way.
We sort of planned it that way. The exhibit had been up for, maybe a month or so, and we hadn't gotten around to making an announcement about the exhibit. And about the time we were planning to make that announcement, then we knew that McCain was approaching his final days, and so then we thought it was just fitting to have a gathering here in Klamath for Ernie on the same day that the nation was remembering Senator McCain.
And gathering is an appropriate word because there's a lot of events that happen at the museum or are sponsored by the museum. People may not realize how often it is, but since we get all of your press releases, we know all too well. There's astronomy events, there's nature walks, there's lectures and speeches that happen inside the museum. There's model railroad train shows that happen every year. How important is it that the museum stays active, not just as static displays, but remains active in having a variety of events?
Well, one thing we've always believed in, both myself as well as our museum advisory board and, of course, our county commissioners that are ultimately responsible for administration of the museum, we've always believed that our work needs to be plainly relevant to people living in the community. We didn't want the museum to become something that never changes or rarely changes. We wanted people to feel personally connected with the activities and events that we do. And so we've tried to reach out to a number of organizations and partner with groups like the Cascade Civil War Society, Klamath Rock and Arrowhead Club, the Spinners and Weavers Guild, the Southern Oregon Horse and Carriage Society, really a long list, as well as some of the government agencies. We've partnered with state parks, with the National Park Service, with the Forest Service, BLM, and for instance, one event that we have coming up in October, it'll be the first Saturday in October. I think that's going to be the 6th. We're going to go out on BLM property and explore the old Topsy grade routes. We actually did this walk last year in partnership with the BLM, and it was a very popular hike. We had to limit the number of participants because it's a pretty tough hike, actually. But we're going to do it again in October, and so that's the type of thing that, well, we feel like there's a lot of history that's not in the museum. We can't get everything in the museum. There's a lot of history out there in the back country even, and so that's an example of how we like to get out and do some exploring.
It actually goes beyond just the Klamath County Museum because you also oversee the Baldwin Hotel as well, correct? So can you explain exactly what the Baldwin Hotel is for people who haven't been in there?
Yeah, sure. So actually, we manage 3 historic properties in the museum system. The old Armory building is what we call the main museum. We call it the Klamath County Museum, but the Klamath County Museum is also a name that refers to a department of county government, which is responsible for 3 properties. So the Baldwin Hotel is the second one. It was added to the museum system in 1978. It was a building that was constructed in 1905, originally as a hardware store and office building, a hardware store on the ground floor, owned by George Baldwin, and then offices on the upper 3 floors. By 1911, Senator Baldwin had converted the old building to a hotel, and it operated as a hotel until 1977. Then the county acquired it. When the county acquired it, it was already pretty well stuffed with antiques and a lot of furniture that had been in the building for decades. And so it really was a pretty natural fit for it to become a museum. It's only open during the summer months. It's a pretty huge building, and we can't afford to keep it heated all winter long. And so we winterize the building. So we'll have tours by appointment. We'll be having flashlight tours again this fall, probably starting around the end of September, and see how long that runs, how much demand there is for that. But by probably November, we'll seal the building up, drain the water system, and just have it kind of hunkered down until next spring. Oh, I might just jump in here and say the Fort Klamath property is the 3rd property that's in the museum system. It was acquired by, well, I should say 8 acres of property there was acquired by the county in 1966 as a park, and then over time the museum developed. And so we now have a museum building there that also operates seasonally. The significant thing about the Fort Klamath site is not only was it the site of a frontier military post in 1863, but it was also the site where participants in the Modoc War were imprisoned following the war, and where 4 of the Modoc leaders were hanged and buried following that conflict in 1873.
The museum itself, yes, it's for the public, but it also is preserving local history through archives. Not only is the entire collection of the Herald and News available there, but a vast amount of historic books and texts and paperwork is filed there. What exactly does the archives entail, and how can people access that if they have specific projects perhaps that they're working on?
We have a fairly steady stream of research requests that come in. If we can answer someone's research question within, our rule of thumb is we say if we can answer a question within 15 minutes, then we won't charge for that. But some people come to us with pretty complex research requests, and so we do charge a fee for conducting that kind of in-depth research. Sometimes people can come in and do their own research. We're not real well set up for that, but if they're, for instance, wanting to search through records on a particular topic, and we might have a folder on that topic, whether it's logging or agriculture, whatever. We have a lot of maps that people can come in and search through. You mentioned the newspapers. We have deed records, naturalization, adoption records, tax records. We even have a book on dog licenses that were issued back in the 1920s and 30s, so some real interesting, quirky records. So there's a lot of material there. We're trying to get some of that online. That's a bit of a challenge for us, but it is interesting when we can make that kind of material online and it becomes available to, say, for instance, someone doing genealogy research. People can often find information about their ancestors that way.
I always enjoy going to museums to find the strangest, most bizarre item there. I particularly like the Lake County Museum out in Lakeview because it has an entire board display of things that were recovered from the sewers that were accidentally flushed. Things like dog tags and false teeth and glasses and all kinds of things. What to you is the weirdest, strangest, macabre, or bizarre thing that the museum houses?
Oh, far and away, it's the cat that Al Lech gave us a couple of years ago. He has a place on Foothills Boulevard, a nice little mule ranch that he had out there. I think he's actually got it on the market at this point. But a few years ago, he found a cat that had passed away inside a haystack, and the body of the cat desiccated and basically mummified, and it's just a bizarre object. Some people are kind of grossed out by it, but most everybody that sees it is just fascinated by it. I'm not sure that it was really the wisest thing for us to take a dead cat into our collection, but people love that kind of freaky stuff. It makes the museum fun.
Taking things into the museum is exactly what I wanted to talk about next, because there are items that get donated that I'm sure are of very important historic preservation purposes, and some things that may be family heirlooms that may be important to the person, but not really relevant to the museum's purpose. How do people go about donating items to the museum, and what is the process behind determining what can and can't be collected?
Well, I appreciate that question, Kurt, because we do have people that bring us some very interesting items sometimes. Old objects. Just the day before yesterday, somebody brought in a short stack of Oregonian newspapers from the 1940s. And, they're fascinating and fun to look at, but they're not a part of Klamath history. They're old newspapers from Portland. And so, and we didn't find anything relevant to Klamath in these papers, and so we declined to accept those materials. Sometimes that's an awkward situation. Probably the single hardest thing that we deal with is people who have grandma's old wedding dress from 100 years ago. Well, we have several wedding dresses that have been collected over the years, and we've decided we're not going to accept any more unless there's something that's just particularly fascinating about an object like that. We've just declined to take materials unless they tell some kind of a story about Klamath that we aren't able to tell otherwise. So the most interesting object we took in recently, probably a couple of weeks ago I would say, is a projectile point that was found by a farmer in the Swan Lake area, we think probably back in the 1930s. It's described as a hasket point. It's basically a spear point. It's about 6 inches long, beautifully crafted out of obsidian. It turns out that it had been tested years ago in what we call the obsidian hydration test, and determined to be somewhere around 10,000 years old. So it was in the possession of this family for 80 years, basically, until Verland Huff passed away here a few weeks ago, and his family decided it was time to turn that projectile point over to the museum. And it's really a beautiful object, and we're very happy to tell that story. To think that someone 10,000 years ago was out hunting with that point. It got left behind somewhere until Verland Huff's father found it in the 1930s. So those are the type of objects that we really find pretty fascinating.
You have finite space for storage as well as for display areas. So how do you go about determining this is show-worthy on the floor and this may be in our back archives and someday we'll maybe do a temporary display to bring it out for short portion of time. How do you balance out what does and does not get displayed in public?
So there's a committee of people actually that we convene once a month to look at objects. We call it the accession committee. So that committee involves 3 museum staffers, myself and our curator and our lead collection assistant, Dan Hawks. And then we have 3 or 4 community members, Gary and Carol Mattis, Avis Kielsmeyer, and Susan Rambo, who will help us size up objects. Sometimes we draw on their expertise and background as longtime Klamath County residents to determine whether an object has value for keeping in the collection. The bigger an object is, the less likely it is we'll accept it. For instance, we get a call probably 2 or 3 times a year from people who have a piano, a beautiful old piano that's been in the family for years and years. Well, we're not going to accept any more pianos. I think we have about 3 or 4 pianos, and that's as many as we feel like we can house. Big, heavy objects are pretty hard for us to accept. Photos, any historic photo of the area, though, we'll just accept that without any question because they're so valuable to us and take up really no space at all.
Are there things that you take on where maybe people agree to loan to the museum for a short period of time and say, I want it back in 6 months, but you can display it for a little while?
We rarely do loans anymore, and the reason for that is in the past, museum staff would accept objects on loan for periods ranging from a few months to a few years. And we've had instances where museum staff would change, turn over, and new museum staff would not know where some of these objects were. And we had one particular case when I was just getting started at the museum, as a matter of fact, with some people that wanted grandma's rosary beads returned. We couldn't find the rosary beads, and we ended up compensating the family with cash. And then the rosary beads turned up a few months later, and by that time the family wasn't interested anymore. They had the cash. And so, but that's just an unfortunate situation where, we don't want to create headaches for museum staff down the line by accepting loans that we have to be, that kind of responsible for things that don't actually belong to the museum.
There's a very famous scene from a very famous film, which may have been the greatest thing for archaeology and the worst thing for archaeology when you think back on the whole Indiana Jones series of films. And I'm thinking of the ending scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark because it's something that I've talked about with other individuals I know who operate museums or have worked at museums when they're just simply hiding the Ark in a massive warehouse and it's just going to be forgotten forever. And I see articles come out every now and then. It seems like every couple of months I see one hit the wire about some amazing treasure that had been just lost in a museum and just been sitting in a box for years in a back room and no one knew that they had it. And then someone opened it up and said, whoa, hey, what's this? How true to life is that sometimes you have no idea what you actually have at the museum? It's been mislabeled or got moved somewhere, and you just walk into the back room and realize, when did we get that? That's kind of cool.
Oh, that never happens. It happens a lot, actually. We don't have anything like the Ark of the Covenant, I'm sure, hiding out in our collection, but we have some gems. And we were talking earlier about what it's like to, work with these artifacts day after day and week after week and so forth. And one of the interesting things that I find is that the longer I work with materials, with collections at the museum, the more I'm able to make connections that I hadn't been able to make earlier because I didn't understand, how things developed or so forth. So I might look at a picture today and think, well, that's an interesting photo. I study the buildings that are in it and study what people are wearing and so forth. And then I could look at the same picture, say, 5 years from now, and I'll notice things that I never saw before because I'm able to make connections with buildings and with a timeline and with families in the community. So those are the kind of discoveries that are pretty fun to make. And sometimes we solve mysteries, like we'll have a photo, we can't figure out where this is or who are the people in this picture. And sometimes with thought and study and let it rest for a while and come back and look at it again, we're able to piece it together. So those are some pretty rewarding experiences.
You mentioned mysteries, and I recall a couple months ago, I wrote an article about some of the lost secret mines of Southern Oregon and some of the robberies and hidden treasures that reportedly have been buried in the area. And I got a couple phone calls afterwards saying, hey, I think I might know where this is. How often do you have people coming in thinking that they have some missing link to solve some great mystery, and all they need is to dig through your archives or pick your brain to figure out the missing piece and think they're going to be like the Indiana Jones that solves some great Klamath Basin rumor?
Well, just yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was speaking with a group of people about the Modoc Indian War. These were mostly ranchers from out of town. They were gathered up at Mike LeGrand's ranch outside of Sprague River. And we were talking about the Modoc Indian War. And there's one guy in the group that said, oh, that's not right. Captain Jack was hanged down by Wairika. And I said, well, no, we're pretty sure he was hanged at Fort Klamath. He goes, no, I was in Wairika 30 years ago and heard a story about a guy who pointed at a tree and said, there's the tree right there where they hanged Captain Jack. And I said, well, there were probably like 500 witnesses that saw him get hanged at Fort Klamath, but the guy could not be talked out of it. It's interesting what people sometimes believe about things.
The museum itself is going to be on the ballot this November. There is a tax levy that has largely funded the museum, and that is up for renewal, is my understanding, for the ballot. Can you explain a little bit more, not necessarily about the ballot measure itself, but about how exactly the museum gets its funding?
Okay, sure. The Klamath County, like many counties around the state of Oregon and across the country as far as that goes, established a local history museum in 1954. And the museum was funded for several decades just out of the county's general fund. That was when Klamath County was pretty flush with funding from revenues from the timber industry. And then, those revenues started drying up. And as far back as the 1980s, the Klamath County Board of Commissioners started encouraging the museum community to find other ways to keep the museum open rather than having it being funded from the county general fund. And so in counties around Oregon, this same story has played out where museums have had to figure out ways to maintain their operations. In some places, the museums, county museums, have closed, like over in Jackson County, for instance. All of the county museums that were operated by the Southern Oregon Historical Society have just closed. Fortunately, we found a lot of support here in Klamath County for people who love their museums and have stepped forward and said, hey, we'll lead efforts to support this museum through various tax measures. The first one was passed in 2006 when Kate Marquez spearheaded an effort to increase our motel tax by a couple of percentage points, and some of that revenue goes to the museum. That makes up about a quarter of our budget. But we were still facing some pretty serious cutbacks and possible closures of the museum or converting it to just a volunteer-operated museum. And so in 2011, a group of people came together and said, we want to go to voters and ask them if they want to continue funding this museum through a tax levy. And so that campaign took place and passed fairly easily. And so that was a 3-year levy that was renewed in 2014, again approved by the voters. That levy expires next year, and so there's a group of people that are organizing a campaign to put the measure back before voters. So that'll be on the ballot again in November.
There's a lot of opportunities to experience history beyond just the Klamath County Museum and its two other sites. There's the Applegate Trail. There's the Tanker 61 Memorial out at the airport. In fact, I just saw you about a week or so ago there when there was a very special event. A classic old warbird got retired in a special ceremony that's going to become part of that memorial. Being a pilot myself, 8-year-old me got to totally geek out being around an old World War II era submarine hunter. It was a Lockheed P-2V Neptune. Seeing the community embrace things like that, there was a very large crowd there. What does that do to you in terms of just hopes for the people's interest in history in the area locally? The fact that there are different areas that people can experience and that there's a general interest in certainly military history because of our connections with the military base here, but just history in general.
Well, Kurt, I think one of the basic reasons that we support museums locally is because we believe that every community has a unique story to tell. across America. You'll find little local history museums that are just preserving the stories of local communities. In fact, there's an association of state and local history groups. So we, at the national level, we have the Smithsonian, and we have various other large museums in metropolitan areas around the country. And at the state level, most states have some kind of a historical society. We have the Portland-based Oregon Historical Society, which is a great organization that covers the entire state. But at the local level, if we want to preserve our stories about the pioneers who settled this area, the Native Americans that have lived here for untold thousands of years, of the people who built our towns, our churches, our schools, our fraternal organizations, made those associations over the years. And, if we want to preserve stories like the water issues, the bucket brigade down Main Street, the timber industry, the sawmills that used to ring Lake Ewana, and there's now just a few signs of those old mills that are fading fast. If we want to preserve those stories, then we have to put out some kind of an effort to preserve that information, preserve the photos, and capture the stories of some of the old timers before they pass on.
I know you know a lot about the local area and have plenty of different stories and fascinating tidbits. Is there a particular favorite that you pull out since the museum does sit so close to the highway, people out of town passing through and want to know something? Do you ever throw out a quick, did you know that you have a favorite about the Klamath Basin?
Oh boy, there's a lot of fun stories. One of my favorites was during the time when gambling was going on in several places down along Main Street. A lot of the taverns had a back room where there were card games going on, and the law would occasionally try to come down on those. Occasionally there'd be an effort to clean up, Klamath Falls. There was one occasion where there's a group of guys playing cards in the back of the Waldorf Tavern. And as they were playing their card game, a guy came in and said, "Okay, boys, this game's over. Put everything out on the table." And so they put all their money out on the table, and he gathered it all up and said, "Okay, you guys line up over there next to that door." And he marched them down the back alley to the courthouse. And into the courthouse they went. He said, "You guys all sit down here in this hallway here." And he went into a room and never came back out. And after a while, the guys started wondering what was going on. And it turns out that guy had found a back way out of the courthouse with all of their money. And so it was a bogus arrest, and they'd been had. So that's just one of my favorite stories.
I know that the funding of the museum is dependent on how people vote this November, but if space and funding were not issues, what are some of the things that you would perhaps like to do at the museum that perhaps you can't right now, or maybe future plans to further develop the museum's facilities or exhibits?
Well, so looking long term down the line, the Armory building is a great building. The architecture of it is fascinating, and the history of it, as we've discussed, is pretty interesting. But it was not designed to be a museum. It doesn't have climate control. We have geothermal heat, which is great. We wouldn't be able to heat such a huge building if we didn't have the geothermal resource. So we're grateful for that. But we only have climate control in a couple of small rooms where we've installed temperature and humidity controls that are more precise than just the on or off of the geothermal system that we have. And so we spent about $100,000 equipping those rooms for climate control, but they're filling up fast. And so, and there's a lot of material that we'd like to be able to put into a climate control environment that we just don't have room for now. So at some point, it would really be nice to find some kind of a facility where we can have a lot more storage for the paper records, the textiles, the newspaper volumes that we have, where they'll be in a more stable environment. We are fortunate to live in an area where we have pretty low humidity most of the time. And so our records are fairly stable where they are. We keep them in as stable of an environment as we can, but the building itself is just not really designed for that type of preservation and conservation work. So that's something we'd like to work on at some point.
How can people get involved in the museum? Do you accept volunteers or people with specific skill sets that can maybe assist in some way. What can people do to proactively support the museum?
Well, there's a lot of opportunities for volunteers. One thing is to help out at the Baldwin Hotel, where we have to give guided tours. Unlike the county museum, where people can just browse around, wander around through the museum on their own, at the Baldwin Hotel, we have to accompany every visitor through the museum. We can't just turn people loose inside the Baldwin Hotel. And so we rely on volunteers to lead tours around the building. And we're always in need of volunteers down there at the Baldwin. At the main museum, we have a lot of jobs that require some technical skill with computers. There's a lot of work that could be done with scanning and indexing and so forth. The challenge there is we have a software program called Past Perfect that's a little bit challenging. It's not like any other program that most people use. It's a database program, and it's designed specifically for museums. And after working at the museum for more than 10 years now, I'm still just barely able to find my way around in Past Perfect. If I really need something, I have to go to our curator and ask Niles to do a search for me. Building and grounds, need care. This past couple of weeks, we've been sweeping cobwebs like mad, and it's kind of frustrating to have to take the time to do that. But, there's tasks like that we could certainly use some help with.
What is upcoming with the Klamath County Museum? There's always events that you seem to be organizing and future plans, special meetings, really fascinating lectures. Anything upcoming that you want to announce or promote?
Well, yeah, there's a number of things coming up. We partner with the Klamath County Historical Society, which is a separate 501c3 nonprofit organization, to put on programs. So later this month, Ryan Bartholomew from Malin will be putting on a program about the history of the community park in Malin, which I don't know how many people are aware that it has one of the greatest collection of trees anywhere in the state of Oregon. And it's because of the efforts that have been put into that park and the swimming pool over the past several decades that make it a very special place in the community. In October, I'll be doing a program about the history of development of highways in Klamath County. We came across a collection of great photos that are actually up at the Oregon Department of Transportation headquarters in Salem that show a number of sites around the community here, what the community looked like back in the 30s and 40s when they were building what they then called modern highways. Our most popular event of the year is Night at the Cemetery, and we'll be selling tickets for that pretty soon. That'll be the 12th and 13th of October. If there's anyone who's not familiar with that program, what it is we have volunteer actors who stand next to tombstones up at Linkville Cemetery and pretend to be those people who've come back to life and are telling their story. And we usually do that program late in the day, right around dusk, and a little bit into the dark of the night. And for whatever reason, people love that program. I don't know whether it's the acting or the darkness, the spookiness of the cemetery, or maybe a little bit of all of it, but people love that event. And we do sell tickets for that event as a little bit of a fundraiser to help out our budget.
So for people who are now intrigued after this conversation and want to stop by the Klamath County Museum, when is it open and what are the costs?
The museum is open 9 to 5, Tuesday through Saturday. Now we're just talking about the main museum here. The Baldwin Hotel is shut down for the winter season already, and Fort Klamath will be shutting down at the end of September for the winter season. Fort Klamath gets snowed in usually, and we don't try to keep that open during the winter months. But the main museum is open year-round, Tuesday to Saturday, 9 to 5. Admission is $5 per person. We knock $1 off for seniors, students, military, veterans, and kids 12 and under are always admitted free when they're with a family member or a school group or a nonprofit group.
Well, Todd Kepple is the director of the Klamath County Museum and resident expert on most of the Klamath Basin history. At some point, I will stump him on something, but so far, he's always been a great resource for me. Todd, thank you so much for coming in and educating us about the museum as well as some history on the local area.
Happy to do it. It's fun to do this, and thanks for doing the program, Craig.